Hello and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, Making Education Work Across the Globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
We're delighted to be joined today by the one and only, drumroll, Alex Quigley. Alex Quigley, welcome to our show. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I feel like I'm really on brand for the show.
Yeah, I think you are. I think it's great. I mean, I think it's great to I'm going to start off by just saying this, that I was working this out earlier, that we met nearly 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Not quite, but, and we've both been on a sort of parallel journey of kind of people who write blogs and talk about our jobs by writing about it, and then have gone on to do different things since we first met. But it was an SSAT conference in Liverpool. Yeah. And we both had been written blogs, and we kind of just found each other and were going, oh my God, yeah, isn't it crazy, all this stuff? People actually read our stuff. We were both so astonished that people actually read our blogs about like nerdy things like marking and stuff. So do you look back fondly on those days, or do you see that as a beginning for you?
Yeah, I think so. I remember that actual conference really specifically. I remember that chat. We were kind of at the top of the stairs. And for me, I was at that point, I was a head of English. I was absolutely exhausted. I still had a toddler, Freya, who's now 13. And I remember I was feeling like really lucky that I was out of school. It was like, that classic kind of, well, you're out, that's your day. You've got out, you've escaped. And it was a bit like that. It was a bit kind of, that's why blogging and social media was so attractive to me, that kind of just broke me out of that kind of high pressure bubble that you're in school. And you kind of have all these like curiosities kind of satisfied that you don't quite get at school because you're so busy like doing everything and kind of trying to support everyone in your team and, grappling with coursework and all that other stuff. So it definitely did start with that writing. I can remember that conversation, that kind of slight incredulity kind of, is this going to last? Why are people interested in this? And I think we just came to that kind of conclusion that it was just speaking to like what was happening in schools and classrooms. And that was a really exciting point. I think that I hadn't seen that for, the first 10 years of my career, just none of that really happened. So yeah, it was a real exciting, fast-paced time. I felt really lucky that I was at school that kind of allowed me to have that freedom and allowed me to look outside. And because some of the things are challenging, aren't they, around marking or, whatever topic it was, lesson observations back then were really contentious. So yeah, it felt exciting. I had a really good boss, thinking of famous John Thompson. So we had a really positive, exciting kind of, journey with kind of the school getting better. And that was always the main thing. It was kind of, how can we make Huntington just the best school in the country? It didn't have any fancy labels. It wasn't, kind of rich with, new buildings or anything. It was just a bit of a, bog standard building. It just had lots of great teachers in. So we just tried to make it the best it could possibly be. And yeah, it just kind of took off. And I feel like there's just lots of points where I got lucky. So being there while John was my boss, I got lucky. Having a great team and a school that wasn't under so much pressure, I got lucky. And I think I got asked to write my first book by Jeff Barton, who also was head of English, I think, like 15, 20 years before at Huntington, this strange lineage. And yeah, it's just moved on from there, and feel like I've worked really hard. I look back and wonder how I wrote as much as I did. With young children. But I think basically having kids killed my social life, which meant that my social media life was my proxy. And it's still there a little bit. So yeah.
And you still hold on to the hunting English. You still haven't let it go, have you? It's like, it's still you. So Huntington, you're still kind of part of that. It's like connected to you. Do you feel like you just can't, it's just a part of your identity?
I think, in all honesty, I've not psychologically analysed it. I think I'm waiting for Alex Quigley to leave Twitter. It's this American guy who quite regularly forwards stuff onto me. He's not quite the John Lewis kind of advert guy, but I'm kind of waiting for him to leave. But he's sticking about because I just want to have my name a little bit. But actually, it is quite funny because quite regularly, I get these American hunting enthusiasts who follow me, kind of expecting to get some kind of breakdown of like, fast action pistols, or whatever else, and they get some really niche edu chat. So I normally block them first to save them the pain. But yeah,
that's funny. I have as a guy called Tom Sherrington who is a lawyer solicitor. He's about 20 years younger than me at least, and he must be sick to death. I mean, I feel sorry for him. I follow him. He's actually quite interesting in talking about legal stuff, but he must be. Anyway, I'm in the same boat as you. So, I mean, we can talk about your whole pathway, but you're doing so many things, the reading and books and writing and the EF. We're going to come on to that. So I want to ask Emma whether what's your first engagement with Alex? How do you feel like he's coming to
I remember seeing Alex leaning very nonchalantly on a lectern at a big conference from our trust, and I remember being absolutely fascinated by everything he was talking about vocabulary development and English and what have you. So it was, and I remember thinking, oh God, he really knows a lot, doesn't he? I'm like, wow, now I get to talk to him. But the question I was going to ask you, Alex, was because you said you started writing, and you partly because of the crippling of your social life by small children, which I fully understand. But actually, there's loads of people who want to write about education who potentially they might not have anything to say or anything new or anything different. Why did you start to write and kind of put it out there? And what would you say to anybody else who wants to start writing?
I think I look back now, I can't remember the actual start, because it's a bit of an act of hubris, isn't it, to start a blog and just think people are just going to listen to what you've got to say. So there is something really un-English about starting to write, I think. And that's a hurdle that a lot of people just never get over. And also there's a kind of, everything I do is just normal stuff. People don't want to hear that, but, and actually it's the normal stuff that gets most hits because people want to hear the normal stuff and want mirrors held up to what they do. And so I can't quite remember the start. I think I'm in a really privileged position now where, so having written, I kind of know the ways in. So like, it's actually surprisingly easy to make contact with, the magazines and TES magazine and Teach Primary and Secondary and Schools Week. And that actually, you just need a well-pitched idea and not much more actually. And even then when I think about books, I think about a lot of the books that are out there, and I think, it's not much more than a really well-crafted book proposal. I think a difference maker, and it's worthwhile being honest, because not everyone gets accepted to write a book. I think having honed your practice, blogging was really important for me anyway. It made me a much better writer because, within 2 or 3 years, I've written 100 blogs and, 100,000 words. So that was really helpful. It honed what I did and made me a better writer, but also it builds your profile. And that's just a real reality of, getting a book deal or writing for someone that if you've got a following, it just makes it easier. Kind of publishers are ultimately commercial. Of course, it's all about quality, but you only have to look at kind of fiction books to see all the celebrities who publish. And that's in part because it's a bit of a guaranteed audience. So I think there's a balance of getting going, practicing in a low stakes way in terms of blogging and even just, tweet threads and stuff like that and extended comments on Facebook, just honing that a little bit and then getting a little bit more ambitious about where you might pitch it. And I've helped lots of people who've said, oh, I've got this idea, what do you think? Or they've sent me drafts of stuff and, I give them feedback. There's quite a few people. There's a group at the EF in the Research Network, and we call Expert Voices, where we've got a session where we kind of give them a bit of training about how to speak about research, how to write about research evidence, and write about teaching ultimately. So there are a few really accessible tricks, if you like. I think the last thing for me, and this is where it gets really hard for busy teachers, and it's why it's a rare thing to actually write a book, which you two know and I know, is that it takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of commitment. And actually, you've got to find some habits to kind of get you through, because teaching and even just doing writing outside of a day job is just really hard. And
what are your good habits?
So I've actually, on my blog before, I asked you, didn't I, Tom, and Mary Myatt to share what you did, because I was kind of like combing, what do other people do? Is it parallel to mine? I'm a real over planner. So I think there's a real continuum. I'm writing about, my next book's about writing. So I've kind of thought a lot and researched a lot about planning. And there's a continuum from people who really plan to, a significant degree, which I do, which I'll come on to. And then there's like your fly by your seat at your pants kind of, right, I'll write it and then I'll look back and see if it makes sense. I think for me, because I've always wanted to write underpinned by good evidence, I didn't want, I was kind of rejecting all of the crap I was served when I was a middle and senior leader and as a teacher. So I wanted to have, some good underpinning that people can go and read that and check that out and find out more and challenge their thinking, but also challenge me and not accept this on face value. So for me, that requires quite a bit of research. So if I'm writing my book now, I kind of start that a year before I write. I don't go into like chapter 1. I have a bit of an idea of my chapter structure, and then I spend a year reading about that area, and I write notes in a lovely moleskin notebook, and I just read and read and read. And I've got these big kind of see-through boxes in my garage, which are all my kind of books for each book. And my process is I read it, I write it all down. I've got all the notebooks on one shelf. Then I type all the notes out. Then I go about writing the chapters. So for me, I've literally got to that content like 3 times already. So it's like my Graham Nuttall kind of repetition.
That's so, an incredible process.
It means that when I actually write it, I write it super fast. I don't take months and months. I don't have months and months, frankly, but I can write in the evening. Every chapter I write has got like 10 pages of notes in bullet point form. So I'm not writing from scratch. The worst thing is when you're tired at night time or on Sunday night is to sit there and have to think of lots of stuff off the top of your head. So I need that kind of, right, it's all there, I'm just working through it. And so I don't think that's everyone's, cup of tea. I can understand why it isn't. But for me, it really works. And it gets me through like the tired evenings, and I can do an hour, and I can sit on a train. I do a lot of writing on trains. I can sit there and just plug in and write another 500 words because it's there in front of me. I'm not having to, okay, what can I write about next?
It's because it's almost like the polar opposite of my method, which is like,
I'm right. I was just sitting there thinking, that's not me.
You're like, right, I bang out a few headings and then sort of like wing it until I've filled in the space. I mean, anyway, but I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I could talk to you just about that, but it's so, God, we need to book you for more than one program. I wanted to ask you about like the theme. You're mining this rich seam of stuff about reading and writing, and Emma and I hosted our EduGive conference a couple of weeks ago, and which you contributed to, and we've raised. It's now notched up one. We raised £33,000 for that, and which I'm pretty chuffed by. And your session there was about the kind of the writing, and there's a common theme, which is this whole thing about intentionality and really sort of breaking it down into stuff which you can teach deliberately. And actually, it makes you realize that means that a lot of people are not necessarily teaching in that way. It's also like it's very holistic. And so, I don't know how can you summarize that? It's hard, isn't it? But the kind of the nub of it, like right, this idea of, if I got that right, this need to really be very focused and intentional. And do you feel that people, have got a lot to learn about that then, from what you observe and what you've experienced?
So it's in part a reflection on myself as a former teacher, where I knew I did a decent job. I didn't do a bad job. I had good relationships. After the first couple of years, I'd started to get good behavior and then became pretty good at behavior after that. I think I was always confident enough in my subject knowledge. Obviously, English is a bit narrower, and I really enjoyed doing new things. So doing media studies, doing English language A-level, I always liked new areas. But I always knew that if a child struggled to write in year 7 or 11, I didn't really know what to do about it. I knew they were struggling, and I knew that I needed to teach them a bit better, but I genuinely didn't know how to break it down for them. I had this, the kind of that classic expert teacher where you're expert in your subject, but you're not expert in how to kind of scaffold novices to anything like expertise. And over time, I had classes. I often got put with like SEN classes and kind of classes with some characters in, kind of situation. And I'd always have a good relationship with them. I always empathize with them, and that seemed to work out. And I was brought up in a school where it wasn't very academic, so I kind of understood people. But I always knew in the back of my head, I was always kind of felt like an imposter, felt like I didn't know enough, felt like I was missing like countless small opportunities. And that's one of the things that kind of drove me to kind of find out more. You kind of look at Dylan Williams' Inside the Black Box, after a few years of your teaching, and think, this makes sense. Is there anything more about this? And it took me about 8 years to find out there was a lot more about that. And then you get to the likes of Rose and Shine, explicit instruction, you get to the likes of recognizing the value of, inquiry, but also how expert you need to be to undertake inquiry type learning. And for me, it just became over time, the more I read, the more I kind of reflected on my experience. And then the more I got to work with young children and primary age projects and researching about early language development, the more it just became really obvious that actually this novice expert kind of continuum that happens over a number of years, it's attending to that at every stage. And it's being really explicit and intentional about that process. And you can only it's all about choices for me. It's about teachers making 50 good choices every day around how they read, around in an English class in Key Stage 3, what they're choosing to read, how they break down the passage. And the problem is with it, it's a little bit like those kind of really, talented students where they're doing it and it's really good, but they're not quite sure why. And I think a lot of good teachers, it's just so tacit that they just enact it. And then we can't seem to share it as a profession. We can't seem to break it down. But for me, I've thought, okay, well, I can't do all of that. I think the likes of Rose and Shine and other colleagues have done brilliantly in foregrounding that, and cognitive science does a good job in giving you strong principles about breaking down learning. For me, I thought, right, well, literacy's been my thing. I feel like I've done it for 10 years and done an all right job, but I want to really get to the bottom of this. And I want to be able to, all those teachers who have that nagging fear and that child who's 13 and can't really write very well and the teacher's not sure about it. I want to write for them over and over. And I want to break it down. And it's got to be actionable. It's got to have evidence underpinning it. But as soon as I get a bit too niche and I'm only speaking to my little clique, then I've lost. So for me, it has been about that explicitness and vocabulary. When you look at vocabulary, that's where I started. It's the ultimate kind of small building blocks of learning, aren't they? Yeah. And that's all they are. But then, you think about there's good theories and good principles about schema development, etc. And then you look at reading and there's ways to break that down. Same with writing. And I kind of just constantly kind of have this sense of like urgency around, if teachers just know a bit more about this with a couple of strategies to enact it, that's just improving some of their small decisions every day. And that's what I've been at.
I think, and it is, just this book, The Vocabulary Gap, with a sort of in short, you've done it really at the back of each chapter in short, boom, boom, boom. You're sort of trying to spell it out for people. And then, Emma, have you got all these lining on the shelf?
Not those ones in the other room, yes. But I was just thinking about, because you mentioned you've got good subject knowledge, Alex, and this is something I've tried to articulate myself, and you could probably do this a million times better, is that difference between subject knowledge and knowledge of your subject. That kind of the subject knowledge of, who wrote this book and what happens in Act 3, page whatever, versus what do you do if this child doesn't understand this? What's the next thing you do? How does this link to that? What's the prerequisites for that? Where does this go from here? How does that link to what we did before? Where are the missing blocks? And I do think, and I don't know whether you think the same, that it's easy to fall in love with subject knowledge because it's interesting and lovely, but it's harder to make people fall in love with knowledge of your subject, about how you actually link it all together.
Yeah, I think so. is it Lee Shulman who's kind of did that content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge. And I know that a bit of a mouthful, but it's what you're describing, which is, yes, you can know, and you need to know, if you're Key Stage 3 English teacher, you need to know Macbeth and know it well. And then you can anticipate the questions and misconceptions and background knowledge. But actually, it's that pedagogical content knowledge, that kind of understanding of the learner in front of you and about the process they're undertaking if they've not quite got that content knowledge. But also, for me, why I've kind of focused in on the literacy aspect is if they haven't got some of the basic skill around handwriting, then they're not getting to that richness around knowledge, and it starts much earlier. So we've talked before, for me, my understanding has grown over time. When I started teaching, I got asked to teach English language A-level in like year one. I was only like 21. I was barely older than the students. And I was that classic thing where I was a chapter ahead, not much more. But learning about child language was a bit of a slow burn of a revelation, but it was a bit of a revelation. And it just made me constantly recognize, well, yes, we need a brilliantly sequenced curriculum. We need to have subject knowledge. But all the evidence indicates kind of like teacher subject knowledge has a threshold of where it becomes less impactful. And then it's about how well you understand the learner's progressions through that and how you understand the skill development from handwriting to spelling to writing to reading. So we like to simplify stuff, and we should, and we want to try and keep the complexity manageable, but it's not as simple as more subject knowledge of Macbeth makes you a better teacher of Macbeth. It just isn't. And we can all share our anecdotes of that teacher. I can remember Mr. Lang in year 8. I've written about him before, about kind of teacher expectations. I remember I met him in a bar and told them what I'd written about him, and he seemed quite happy about it. Really? But he actually talked to us. We were in this kind of inner city school in Liverpool. We weren't necessarily mathematicians, and we certainly didn't think we were mathematicians. But he used to tell us about how he really struggled with maths at school, and how it was a bit of a later in life thing for him, but now he wakes up with maths problems, etc. And we were, 12, 13, or a little bit skeptical of every adult in the room, but actually I remember having an enduring impact that he didn't find maths easy, and that for him it was a challenge that he worked through. And I think that reality, for me, I've always had a bit of a lens on English through some children came to my secondary school, fluent readers, who were brilliantly prepared for all of this curriculum. And I didn't need to think very hard about handwriting, about spelling. It just happened. But for the children I thought needed most of my help, they're the ones where I needed a better, deeper, richer understanding of their knowledge, their skill. And now I know all that stuff around procedural knowledge. Well, so is it skill? Is it procedural knowledge? I use the word skill because it's a bit of an end goal, but I'm really conscious that a lot of teachers, if they hear procedural knowledge, don't understand what it means. And we need to try and always make sure that we are communicating this. We are breaking it down for teachers in a way that's manageable, and we meet them where they are. And then we can bring them into some of that complexity. But, ultimately, I think an emphasis in the last couple of years around curriculum, around building knowledge, is a great way in. And it's necessary, but I think it's necessary but insufficient. And it's particularly insufficient if pupils don't have the skills or the procedural knowledge to write about what they've read, to read those complex texts.
One of the things I find, I see practice, more and more now, I get to go all through primary, secondary, and I feel like there's an understanding at a certain point, like with phonics and very early instructional parts of writing, that you have to sort of teach everything. But then comes quite an extended period, year 5, 6, 7, 8, where there's somehow the sense that it's all a bit of an art, and you're trying to get the kids to be creative and imagine. So that I see of a drop off of teachers' willingness to be instructional, and then it's a kind of like it's all a bit of a miss. That you don't want to they're worried about shackling, about spoon feeding, about having everyone writing the same paragraph. And there's a real tension about getting kids to be generative and imaginative and bringing themselves into the writing, as well as teaching them the structures. And I find that tension is real, because you want kids to be able to kind of be playful with words and stuff like that. But do you know what I mean? I feel like the students who struggle with that just need the modeling more continually. And then it's, how do I deal with kids who are ready to fly and others who aren't? So it's hard, isn't it? I mean, do you have a sense of that? And I feel like this stuff is not simple, getting that balance right.
Yeah, I feel like for me, I get this kind of amazing experience where on Friday, I'm speaking to an infant school, a primary school, and 2 secondary schools. And you've got to make sure the content is relevant. And for me, they're my favorite events, because actually you've got to describe that progression. And I think that's where we go wrong in terms of the nature of language. Vocabulary changes through school. The nature of how we read changes. So, take reading. In primary school, we start with story because we should. And we start with, listening to stories and talking about stories. And that never goes away. And we should have that strong sense of narrative underpinning the primary school curriculum. But as you get particularly into Key Stage 2, but it always starts earlier than we assume, you get this more dense informational texts. The language starts to become more nouny, those bigger words. And we start to, change words from sweat to perspire. And then you make this leap from year 6 into year 7. And there's almost a sea change where you're reading lots of fiction and nonfiction. And then instantly in week 1 of year 7, you read like fiction for a tiny window of the week, and everything else is dense nonfiction. You've got worksheets, you've got PowerPoints that are kind of, simplifications and abstractions. You've got textbooks. And so as you go through school, language changes, how you read changes, how you write changes and develops. But the curriculum is such where the curriculum shifts as well. And because understandably, if I'm in secondary school and I've been trained to teach my subject and I've got bloody enough on, thanks, don't give me anything else to think about, how they were reading and writing in Key Stage 2 just feels less relevant to what's ahead of us. And then if you're in primary school, you've got enough pressures on that you just expect secondary are going to pick up the baton and do it bloody well. And I think for me, there's not enough attention in terms of teacher understanding and training, not on the teacher's fault. It's just the lack of time, the lack of kind of, this being baked into how you're trained to be a teacher, that things change. And that, the likes of reading. So I think over the last 5 or 10 years, the likes of understanding phonics has become, a recognition. The evidence around it's been heavily debated. The understanding about how reading comprehension is this complex mix of background knowledge and decoding and phonics plays a role in that. I think we're moving forward, but that's moved forward a lot in primary schools because that's salient, that's solving your problems, but then it's not really moved forwards in secondary schools. So, because understandably, there's other challenges to get to grips with. So I think if everything's so nuanced and changing over time, it makes complete sense that busy teachers with too little time on their hands to plan and develop curricula and think about learning and how we might teach, that we just miss those little opportunities. I think also there's some beliefs that underpin some of these things. So I think there's like some beliefs that underpin writing and reading and being a mathematician. And it's this notion that it's natural or not. And I think if you work with young children, and Emma, please come in and give me a kicking.
Oh, I've got lots to say, Alex, about what's been said.
You work with young children, and actually, so I've written about Child Haven Nursery School. They're focusing on self-regulation, on talk, on turn-taking. The revelation for me was that when the child was deciding whether to go out to play or not, and there's a little window in the door, and to show them whether it's raining or not, and then they pick their wellies and they pick their coat up. That for me that's really important for a 5-year-old to start developing that self-regulation. Fast forward 7 or 8 years, and actually self-regulation is happening in your head. It's about planning an exam response. It feels so different. And I think people can't quite, because we're in different phases and different silos, we can't quite connect up our different beliefs, our different experiences. So the naturalness of, say, creativity when you're young, well, you can be more creative perhaps with stories and writing in Key Stage 2, and you should be. but actually at the same time, you're still building sentences and you're still making choices about vocabulary. And I think
let's hear your intense critique of everything Alex has just said.
No, it's interesting what you said about the 5, 6, 7, 8, which is, I understand, is also a step song, but I'm not going to do that. But the 5 and 6 is hugely instructional. You know, I've taught in year 6 forever, and that's the bread and butter of year 6. Partly because you've got such high stakes accountability where you've got to get children to jump through hoops. But one of the things I wanted to pick up on was about different types of writing. So one of the things I noticed, Alex, was when they got rid of the writing sat, the externally marked writing sat, was that the way that we taught writing changed. And it went from being a very kind of broad range of lots of different types of writing that we would do, and the children would know the text type and they would know how to structure a recount and a historical report versus a persuasive argument versus a balanced argument, because they didn't have to have that on tap to be able to like regurgitate the situation. It changed. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because what it did do was free up more time to actually fall in love with English as a subject. Because if they haven't fallen in love with it and are reading for pleasure by the time they leave year 6, it's unlikely that they're going to suddenly start to become an avid reader. And if we know that reading is the biggest predictor of future success, then surely the bread and butter of the primary school teacher is to make them fall in love with reading, but also to have that kind of deep, rich instructional understanding of how language is built and structured, but which kind of peaks in year 5, 6, I'm guessing. But because that change over time that you were mentioning as well is really interesting, because yes, we do loads of phonics and loads of kind of, here's the introduction to what all these squiggles on the paper actually mean. But at the same time, we have to balance that with developing vocabulary, immersing them in story, getting them to do the physical movement of the hand. It's so hugely, I don't want to say difficult, but it's hugely challenging to be the person who introduces children to spoken language, written language, you know, reading language. It's huge. I would really love people further on in the system, be that junior teacher, so Key Stage 2 teachers coming to foundation, or secondary teachers having an appreciation of that change. I think it would be hugely beneficial. And I was secondary trained, but ended up in primary. So I've done lots of work in both parts of the sector. And I just think there's so much to kind of build on and capitalize on in terms of understanding the journey from the day they set foot on the site in foundation all the way through to when they go through to the next part of the sector, and how both the instruction and the immersion in it changes.
Yeah, and so there's like 10 things in there. I want to pick up on a couple of them. So the one thing you said about avid readers and loving reading, and that's an aim and a goal by the time they leave primary school. I agree with that. And I think if you're not an avid reader by age 11, I completely agree with what you said. You're unlikely to be later on. I think for me, it's how do you get to that point where they're avid readers? And I think that you said about love reading. And I think being an avid reader and loving reading comes with a lot of beliefs and kind of emotive stuff behind it. So when you say you love reading, do you love reading emails? Do you love reading like scientific reports? Probably. We mean we love reading, we love story, we love poems, we love, you know, seeing our world, kind of holding up a window or a mirror to our world. And I think that's where an emphasis in primary school, understandably, is this love and reading for pleasure. And I'm not saying it is an end goal that we should all pursue, and I read for pleasure. I also read with a purpose. And I think as you get into secondary school, reading is often less pleasurable. It becomes a functional thing to access the curriculum, to interpret sources in history, to read case studies and to read science questions. And I think for me, I'm more interested in that avid reader. What got them an avid reader? Well, effectively, they're really good readers. And for me, I think I want less of the emphasis on loving reading and more of the emphasis on being a skilled reader. Because the love happens when you can do it really well. We love things that we're really good at, and we can get away and enjoy things we're not great at, but we don't do them for the rest of our lives. We have a laugh because we go skiing and fall over, but we don't become an elite skier. So I think reading should be about, that skilled reading. And then the 5, 6, 7, 8 is about, well, at every step there's skilled reading that's needed. And we need to recognize that the skilled reading in year 8 in science is a bit different to the skilled reading of, Catherine Rundell's The Explorer narrative in year 6.
Like Sonia Thompson, who talks about it, she talks about the skill and the will. Like it's like in her school, she's done like loads of like skill, like tons. They're big into dogmatic reading approaches and intentional, like accountable reading, that kind of thing. But also loads of bigging up, celebrating reading and reading being a goal. And so in a way, it's like the weaving together feels more
they're not intention. They are reciprocal. They reinforce one another. But I think in social media or in writing and in debate, they often become pitched as these opposites. And that's where, so Sonia at St. Matthew's, I could tell you their writing programs, I can tell you their reading focus, because they're so intentional about it. They've explained it. And what's great is, they do Talk for Writing. Well, Talk for Writing breaks down the writing process really skillfully, and just like Doug Lemov and the kind of those acts of reading becoming names, becoming practices that people can enact. It's why Teach Like a Champion sold, whatever billion, how many it sold in the US, because it really names some of these seemingly obvious practices, the kind of process of teaching, where it makes them accessible in ways we didn't find accessible before. We just had words like love and passion and kind of, and skill. But actually, we didn't deconstruct that skill, and we didn't work backwards to think, what strategies and knowledge is required to be skilled? Skill is an endpoint. And what are the things to get along the way? And I think that's where in year 5 and in year 7, there are lots of parallels between how you read and how you write and how you talk and vocabulary, but there are also changes. And it's why I like, in the secondary literacy guidance report, which I have the privilege of co-writing, in that it's got this tree of literacy, and the roots and the trunk is this kind of central general literacy. We all need words. We all need to be able to write clearly and cogently and spell accurately. But then it starts to branch off. And I think for me, primary school is about tending to the roots, and it's about, kind of growing that sapling and supporting it, and, all those lovely little supports that a young tree needs. Then you get into key stage 3 and it's growing. Well, get into key stage 2 and it's growing rapidly. And by key stage 3, you've got this mature oak, and lots of pupils just can't deal with it. And it's, how do we get those rungs up that tree? How do we think every step is really clear? We know the moves. And one of the analogies I really love about writing is by Kellogg, not Cornflakes, the chap, by a researcher. And he's talked about writing's like a game of chess. It's got all the different moves. It's got the same pieces on the board every time, but the infinite variety of moves you can take is where the skill and the expertise happens. And what I love that chess analogy, and I've stolen it from my next book and I use it like 100 times. It's what research is, isn't it? You're sharing what all the best ideas other people had before you. And in that set of moves, I think about the same for reading. There are a set of strategic moves when you read. Some of it's decoding, some of it's fluency, some of it's word knowledge, some of it's reading strategies like summarization, etc. And all of the moves are needed to play the game. And for me, I think I kind of go back to my favorite things I've ever written, my favorite blogs, the favorite things in my book are those stories of children where actually some of them didn't play the game really well. And that's where I think it's why I work where I work in terms of EEF as a charity. It's why I'm writing about literacy now, and I don't know what I'll do after, but I'm plowing a half decent furrow. But I think it's that, what about those kids who can't play the game, forgotten third, whatever we call them, but there's too many of them. And in this next one, I've written about my dad. And, it's quite a personal one, where my dad, when he was, 14, 15, mum went to grammar school, dad left school at 15, got a job on the corner of his street. Now, fine, that's what happened then. My mum had children, so she was kind of closed out of the professions and everything else for various reasons that we live in a patriarchy. But my dad actually never got to learn to write. And he can read the sports pages and stuff like that. And he can hold a conversation and a political argument with anyone. and he can win that argument if he chooses. He's a fiercely intelligent person, but he's never been able to write a job application. He's never been able to write a poem. He's never been able to communicate in ways that we all take for granted. And there's millions of people like that. And there's children like that in every classroom. And actually, we can do a little bit less of that fighting and arguing over theories and all that stuff. And actually, we've got a lot of work to do to help those children play that game. And it can be enjoyable and fun. And they bring so much to it, even when they don't have cultural currency. And we learn a lot from them. And it's why teaching is like infinitely interesting and fun. But ultimately, we've got to break down that game. And if they love it by the end, fantastic. But let's make sure we practice the moves.
That's so interesting. So, I mean, does that make that challenges your perspective as well? I'm sure it does.
Yeah, definitely. And I just wanted to tell Alex something that happened today. I actually took my 3 children to a bookshop today, and my 5-year-old bought a Minecraft book. Can't read it at all, but was playing Minecraft, trying to read the book and coming to me and saying, right, what does this say? Because I need to know what I need to do on there. And I was thinking, well, there's the will, not yet the skill. Yeah. Not yet the skill. But he's not reading, he's not falling in love with a book and a narrative. He's just like, I know I need this in my life to be able to do that.
And I saw this last week in a lesson. In fact, I took a picture of it. It was so interesting, like a year 7 lesson, they're doing Orwell, Animal Farm. And this kid has written this brilliant sentence, which I've took a picture of. And it says, this is a year 7 kid, Orwell creates the impression that Boxer is fiercely strong because, quotes, he seemed more like 3 horses than one, suggesting that he has 3 times the strength than any other horse. And it's like, and then you go to the side of the page and it's got point 1, give credit to the author, Orwell, say the impression, gives the impression that, use because, and then explain evidence. So like, there's this whole structure which has given that kid the tools to say an idea. And of course, it's very structured, but it's when you read you take the structure away and the kid is learning that, you're thinking that's empowered that child to get into this text in a way which they'd never have been able to do before. And they're starting to feel like a writer. They're thinking, get me writing about Orwell like a writer. Yeah. And it was like their sense of themselves as a writer, when they told me their sentence, it's quite moving. It was like, you really believe in this, don't you? It's like, you haven't just copied off the board. You've written that whole sentence on your own. And the teacher's giving you the tools to do it. I thought it was magic. It's funny how it works, isn't it? It's like, obviously they have to be able to do it later without the structure.
But so that's a really great example of, on social media, people might argue, oh, they've done a P paragraph, they're awful, they're despicable, they constrain creativity and all this. They're a tool that you need to, or a variation of that, you need to supply, you need to model, you need to structure, break down the steps, create a sequence. And then, as you say, you take that scaffold slowly away. And I think our issue is we often, because we're pressured for time and we've got exams that are looming and everyone's going to pays linked to them and all that other business, that we never really have the confidence to take away the scaffolds and to let struggle happen and to kind of build it back up again. And for me, I'm not that bothered about whether Peel or it's who, what, why, whatever structure you use, just be intentional that you're using a scaffold and then you are going to take it away at the opportune moment. And tell me any, I am a kind of I've spoken for a while and believe in deliberate practice. It is about you practice those moves, a rondo in football, scales in music, we can go on, we can, do all of them. But you practice them, and then that confidence that child has, that voice that they start to get, that voice that's got it's like academia, and they start to learn, okay, I can switch it here, I can change my voice. And it doesn't happen overnight. And actually some of their writing is derivative and not great. But that's a step, that tree, that they're climbing. They're only climbing. They're not there yet. And some children need more scaffolds for longer. This is where I think that that kind of challenge in Key Stage 3, where because Key Stage Year 5 and Year 6 teachers do a brilliant job at scaffolding reading and writing and these kind of processes of learning that are so essential and talk, that actually we just assume they're there by secondary school and we're not as intentional about them. And I think that's what we need to get right, I think.
I think what's just popped into my head while you're talking, Alex, is a little bit like the children need to learn a series of recipes, and they need to know how that recipe works and perfect each recipe. And then when faced with a store cupboard of ingredients, they know how a basic recipe works, so they can create their own dish.
Yeah.
If you don't know how the individual recipes actually work to create something, you're never going to be able to create anything edible from that cupboard if you haven't had somebody point out, this is how you make an omelette, this is how you make this is how you make that. Yeah. And we wouldn't do that with a chef.
But our problem is, what we do is, I watch myself and my kids, we love watching Great British Menu, and we watch all these like Michelin star chefs, and we can use that language. But actually, then my children aren't going to, myself, we're not going to learn to cook like that without a long process of building up to it. And I think sometimes, so in English or in history, we share these amazing examples of knowledge and writing and, historical artifacts. And actually, they are amazing, but pupils are quite a distance away from them. They're still grappling with the basic ingredients. So it's about, I don't think, we don't simplify everything, but we think really carefully about that sequence and about the scaffolds needed to access that. That's why I think the curriculum focus of the last couple of years is really good, but not if it's at the exclusion of developing understanding of how to develop as a writer or a reader, and how talk and self-regulation, and how children learn to make decisions for themselves. If all of that is kind of quashed by our sequence demand, then that for me is not enough. That's necessary but insufficient.
Like a lot of things, it's like, a big theme of the EduGive conference was less is more. More time, more time to practice, more time to explore, more time to consolidate, and then the stuff can follow. Look, to be honest, we're getting warnings about our time here. We're kind of already run over, and I feel like I wouldn't even mention your job with the EEF and the whole evidence base, but I feel like it's all, in a way, it's good because that's the kind of process for getting evidence into people to do all these things really well. And I think we'll have to talk to you another time about that, but. Yeah, I love the passion that comes through. I feel like you could probably talk about reading and writing like indefinitely because it's.
Well, there is one of the challenges in our profession, because we kind of burn teachers out and churn them out, is that we've got kind of a really poor collective memory. So we're constantly having to retrain teachers, and I'm not saying anything that hasn't been written by better minds than mine. I've got a little bit of a knack for kind of piecing things together and making it accessible because I lived that experience. I think, and I think we've got to get better at supporting teachers right from the start. And ECF and there's other elements that I think are really promising in terms of a career-long development, because you just can't teach children these complex, nuanced, kind of processes, skills, and the knowledge without that kind of detailed understanding yourself and support over time. So yeah, I think I probably could talk about it for decades, and that's the problem. I shouldn't. These books shouldn't be that popular, because actually this should be baked into what every teacher's finds out in the first 5 years of teaching, and there are signs of promise. So there's a new NPQ coming from the government for next year for leading literacy, and when it needs to be developed into training, etc. But when you look at like the basic scaffold of that, the evidence that underpins it, it's all of this stuff, and
exciting. And I feel like, teachers are learning. And there's nearly everyone we speak to on our program here is involved in this process at some level of teacher development, and we're really excited about that. And I just think I'm going to sort of wrap things up now, really, because I feel like, it's so great to talk to you. I just have always, ever since I met you, loved you're just so sort of, there's an intensity there which I find incredibly inspiring. Like it really matters, and it's sort of, you really mean it, and I love that. But you really know your stuff, and it's really great listening to you talk about all these ideas. So I hope people, go and when they're writing books out there, the full suite of gap closing. We're into gap closing. We mind our gap. You're closing.
Yeah.
Alex Quigley, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll hope to talk to you another time before too long. Thank you so much. And to everyone else, thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. Emma and I love these conversations. There's been some brilliant guests recently, and wonderful talking to Alex. So see you again on another program. Thank you.